Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Duncan Pritchard. He's Distinguished Professor of Philosophy in the Philosophy Department at the University of California, Irvine, and he works mostly in epistemology. And today we're going to focus on topics like truth, epistemic relativism, epistemic luck, epistemic risk, education, intellectual virtues, intellectual humility, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Pritchard, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thanks, Ricardo, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be on your show.
So I would like to start by asking you a little bit about truth here. I guess that perhaps this is a bigger question than it would seem at first sight, but what does truth mean exactly? What is truth, particularly for someone who works in epistemology like yourself?
So this will probably shock you. It shocks students anyway when I tell them this, but I don't think truth is a difficult one. I mean, what's difficult, I think, from a philosophical point of view, is our access to the truth. The truth, it seems to me, is just whatever's the case, right? So I think that simple conception we have, what does it mean when we talk about, something? Just think about it. What does it mean? You assert something's the case. What makes it true? Well, is it the case or isn't it the case? So is it like that? If it's a fact about the world, is it like that in the world, or is it not like that? What's really tricky about truth, I think what makes everything seem complicated, is that questions about what truth is, which I think are straightforward questions, get intermingled with questions about how we access the truth. How do we know when we've got the truth? But those are epistemic questions. And that's what epistemologists deal with, which is not so much what is truth, but how do you know when you have it? What is it to know the truth, to grasp the truth? What is it to be able to tell when you've got the truth, and so on? So I think the really interesting questions here are epistemological. Truth itself, I think, is just whatever's the case.
Okay, but then getting into the complicated question that you mentioned there, how can we be sure that we are able, through any method, any epistemological approach, to access the truth? And if we get at the truth, how can we be sure that we really got at it?
Yeah. Well, this is of course the skeptical problem. I mean, it goes back to antiquity, right from the start of people asking philosophical questions. They've been asking that particular philosophical question, because it's not clear, right? It's not clear. I mean, what certainly seems to be the case is that there's perhaps nothing, or certainly hardly anything, about which if you know it, you can be you know it infallibly. It's transparent to you that you know it. There's always the possibility of error. So that's just a fact about our human condition, as it were. I mean, if there's a God and God has knowledge, then presumably he can be absolutely certain of what he knows. But that's not our condition. Our condition is one of inherent fallibility, of defeasibility, of the possibility of error. But there's more to skepticism than that, because of course the mere possibility of error doesn't mean you are wrong. And so then you get into further questions. Well, like obviously certain truths are more prone to error than other kinds, and so on. So, a lot of the history of ideas is about people discovering there's more error than they thought. You go back to antiquities, they travel to other cultures and they realize people do things differently. And then they wonder, well, why do we think this over here, right? Are these, what makes our customs true, and so on. And then, you fast forward, people discover microscopes, and then they realize that what looks like solid objects aren't solid underneath, and so on. They've got lots of things popping about, and so on. So more space than matter inside solid objects, and so on. So people start to doubt the extent to which the senses give us truths about the world, and so on. So these are hard questions. And as I say, one of the things I talk about, one of the things I'm most interested in is skepticism, particularly radical skepticism. Are there arguments which show that you can't know anything? And in fact, I think there are some pretty good arguments, actually, or on the face of it, good arguments that show it's actually impossible to know anything of substance anyway. I mean, I can tell you a bit about those arguments if you like, but that's as I say, there's the issue about what the truth is, and then there's this issue about access to it. And I think skeptical trains of thought, they're really focused on the latter, and they are interesting, deep philosophical questions.
So tell us a little bit more about radical skepticism, and perhaps what do you think is valuable in that sort of approach? I mean, because of course people could just perhaps say that it could be easily dismissed because, for example, if a skeptic, a radical skeptic, would claim something like, "Oh, there is no truth out there to be found," or something like that. I mean, since he would be making that truth claim, people would just say, "Oh, you're contradicting yourself because you say there's no truth to be found, but then you're making this truth claim." So, but I mean, it's more complicated than just that, saying that itself contradictory, right? I mean, there's probably more to it, epistemologically speaking, that is valuable to consider here, right?
Yeah, it's useful here, I think, to compare skepticism as a position versus skepticism as a paradox. So in antiquity, there's this position called Pyrrhonian skepticism. The Pyrrhonian skeptics, this is an ethical position. That is, in the broad sense of an ethic, like how not ethics as we think now as morality, but ethics in the sense of how ought one to live. And the idea is that the good life is a life of doubt. The thought is that it's dogmatism, it's conviction that leads to disquietude of mind. And the way you get to quietude of mind, what they call ataraxia, was through a suspension of belief. So you should employ these skeptical doubts. And in doing so, you can end up with a kind of, you sort of acquiesce and sort of flow through life without asserting things and so on. And it's a really interesting position. In fact, it has a lot of commonalities with Eastern thought, like with the Buddhist and proto-Buddhist thought, Jainist thought. And there's a reason for that, because Pyrrho, we know he traveled with Alexander the Great in his campaigns, and he made it across the Indus with Alexander, and he met these Indian mystics. And he wasn't really interested in their mysticism, but he was interested in the kind of the techniques that they were employing, of sort of basically techniques of radical doubt. And so he brought them back. He got rid of the religious aspect of this and just focused on those radical doubt things and aspects, the modes he called them, these skeptical techniques. Yeah. And so, yeah, he became very interested in how to live a good life of quietude of mind through avoiding conviction. Now, that's Pyrrhonism is quite interesting because it's a lived position, and because it's a lived position, you can't doubt everything, because then you couldn't do anything if you doubt everything. You need some beliefs in order to function. And so one of the big questions of Pyrrhonism is, how far can the doubt go before it starts to undermine itself? And that's because it's a position. Now, fast forward to Descartes. Descartes in the Meditations, he has a more radical form of doubt. But for him, it's not a position. It's really crucial. It's a methodology. He's not saying, I am literally going to doubt everything. What he's saying is, like, we can sort of do the intellectual exercise, as it were. What would it mean to doubt everything? So not that we live the doubt, not that we try and go outside afterwards after we've done this doubt, but that we think of it just methodologically speaking. What would it be to doubt everything? And we try to think of an epistemology that would survive this methodology of radical doubt. And of course, he's not a skeptic. He's an anti-skeptic, but his methodology, as it were, lives on, and his anti-skepticism doesn't. So people got very interested in this methodology. And I think it's the methodology of paradox. It's like, when you start to think deeply about our epistemic practices, you realize that there are conflicts there. We have ways of thinking, principles in play, which, if we employed them consistently, would entail we don't know anything. And yet we feel like we do know lots of things. So there's a deep tension there. And that's what a paradox is. You think of paradox of vagueness. We talk as if there's objects and we can pick them out, but when we think about what objects are, they're vague. And so it seems, how does the two things seem to be in tension with each other? Or free will, we have these thoughts about what agency is, what freedom is, and then we look at the world around us, we think, how could such a thing coexist with that? Well, it's like that with skepticism. We look at our ordinary ways of thinking, our ordinary epistemic practices, and we think, well, if we followed through these principles we have, then we'd end up doubting everything. But at the same time, we feel like we know lots of things. So there's like a tension there in our own concepts. And the principles they're appealing to here, think about radical skeptical hypotheses. These are scenarios which everything is as it seems. Everything as it seems in the normal case, but you're being radically deceived. So, think about like the the famous one is the brain in a vat, which is kind of like an adaptation of Descartes' evil demon hypothesis. But you're a brain in a vat, you're being fed these experiences through, supercomputers are feeding you these experiences to your brain or whatever. So you feel like you're walking around. I feel like I'm talking to you. I feel like I'm sitting in this room and so on. But actually, none of it's really happening. I'm just a vat floating around in a vat of nutrients, a brain rather, floating in a vat of nutrients. And the thought is, well, that's an error possibility. And normally you have to exclude error possibilities. You have to know that they're false. But it seems, how would you know that error possibility is false? That's the difficulty. After all, everything subjectively is exactly the same. I can't, it's like if you're dreaming, you can't pinch yourself to wake yourself up because you dream the pinch. Well, it's like that in the vat, whatever you would do, like suppose you thought, I can feel my legs, so I can't be a brain in a vat. Because brains in vats don't have legs. But of course, in the vat, you would have vat legs. You'd feel like you had legs, even though you don't have legs, and so on. So there's a real issue here. It seems error possibilities should be excluded, but there are certain kinds of error possibilities we can't exclude. So how is it then that I know, for example, that I've got hands? Because obviously the brain in a vat doesn't have hands. I feel like I know I've got hands. But everything I appeal to, when I say I know I've got hands, I can feel them, I can see them, and so on. Well, the brain of that can feel them. The brain of that can see them. So how do you know you've got hands now? What grounds your cognitive contact with the world? Doesn't seem to be your senses, and so on. So these are the kind of arguments that make people wonder about whether it's possible to have knowledge. And the worry you had about skepticism being self-defeating doesn't really affect that, because it's not, the idea is not that the idea is not that it's coherent to be a radical skeptic. The idea is more that radical skepticism is a puzzle that we all face when we start to think in a thoroughgoing way about our epistemic concepts. It's paradoxical. That's the thought.
Very interesting. And so it's one thing to ask what is truth and how we can really uncover truth, if that's even possible to begin with. But another kind of question is, what is valuing truth? Because, of course, we hear all the time people saying that they value truth, but what do they mean by that exactly?
So a lot of philosophers will say that to value truth means to sort of maximize true beliefs or something like that. So, you should try and have as many true beliefs as you can, try and have as few false beliefs. I think that's completely wrong. That's a big mistake. Because if you think about it, if that's what value in truth is, then to value truth would be easy. Don't go outside, just sit on the internet and find as many simple things as you can and memorize them or something like that. That would be easy. The old example used to be we don't have phone books anymore, but maybe you're old enough to I'm old enough to remember phone books,
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, so you tell this to my students, they're looking at phone books, but the old thing used to be, well, you can memorize phone numbers. There you go. And each one's a truth, a piece of cake. You can have lots of as many true beliefs as you want with the phone book. But what's interesting about that is that doesn't feel like it's valuing truth at all. And I don't think it is. To value truth is to care about the world around you, to want to have a way of understanding the world around. And by the world around you, I don't just mean the physical world. I mean the social world. It could be your inner world as well. I think it's any domain of substance. Trying to understand. I think to care about the truth might mean you read novels because you want to understand the human condition or something like that. It might mean you go to the art gallery because you want to understand what the art's trying to tell you, and so on. So it's not just physical facts, but it's to care about the way things are. And I think what we're interested in is I like to think of it in terms of a map. So if someone asked you to draw a map of a region, and you went away and you mapped in incredible detail one tiny corner of that region. Yeah. Someone would say to you, look, you don't understand what a map is. This is useless, right? Because it is useless. To map is to sort of get the big structure of things and then to start to fill in the detail from that structure. And I think that's what someone who cares about the truth does, right? It's not like they don't just want to maximize true beliefs. They want to understand how it all fits together. They want to get to the heart of things. They want to see how this over here connects to this over here, and so on. And I think this is where the intellectual virtues are very important. So going back to Aristotle, we have this, in fact, but all intellectual traditions have some similar idea. You have similar ideas of Confucius, for example, in classical Indian philosophy. But for us, it's Aristotle. It's this thought that that we can think of good intellectual character. People have good habits of mind. Mm-hmm. And one of the distinctive features of good intellectual character is people care about the truth. They care about accuracy. They care about getting things right. They care about understanding the world around them. They're curious. They want to see how things fit together. They want to get to the bottom of things. And it drives their inquiry. And I think it's that kind of virtuous desire for the truth is what we're in. When we talk about valuing the truth, that's what we're interested in. It's what we try to instill in our students, for example. We don't just want our students to know lots of facts. We want them to have a drive within themselves, a curiosity to see how things fit together, and have the rigor of mind to be able to do it for themselves, to work out how things fit together, and to be dissatisfied with certain answers, and to keep inquiring until they find answers that are good enough.
So since you've already mentioned the intellectual virtues there, let me take this opportunity and ask you already a little bit more about that. So what are intellectual virtues exactly? I mean, you mentioned Aristotle there, and I guess that it's safe to say that at least in the Western tradition, Aristotle must be the biggest virtue ethicist out there. So, but are intellectual virtues the same as moral virtues, or are intellectual virtues a different kind of virtue, distinct from moral virtues?
So for Aristotle, the virtues are primarily moral. I think we can distinguish them. I mean, certainly some of the traits that Aristotle's talking about when he talks about the virtues, when he talks about a good character. So virtues are a character trait. So they're things that add traits. When the virtuous traits are admirable traits of character, these are traits that you've acquired, that you're responsible for, not the things that you're born with, not just your skills or anything. These are the things that you've acquired over time through your good character, and which we admire people for. Whereas the vices are the opposite of that. They're the things that are despicable character traits. They're things we blame people for. So someone's mean and cruel or whatever. These are their vices, and that we blame them for them because we think that over time their behavior has led to them to have these traits. Whereas the virtuous people, we think that their good behavior over time has led them to have these virtuous traits. And some of them are moral, some of them are intellectual. And in fact, in many cases, this is why it gets complicated. There's a kind of moral and an intellectual side. So think about courage. Courage seems to be a virtue. Courage can manifest itself, maybe moral courage. You help people in need and you take risks to yourself, whatever. But there's a kind of intellectual courage. Yeah. You think about people who are willing to stick to the truth even when it's unpopular. People are willing to voice ideas, not because they want to be awkward, just because they care about the truth and they feel people around them aren't doing that. In any society, there's always some issue where we depend upon the intellectually virtuous people to keep us to the straight and narrow, as it were. So here's a character trait, courage, and it has both a moral and intellectual aspect. And then some virtues like kindness seem specifically moral. Some virtues like I'm trying to think of a good example of this. All the ones that spring to mind. I was going to say intellectual humility, but of course there's humility and there's intellectual. But there's a lot of these virtues, we can think of them as being specifically intellectual. So think about intellectual humility. Humility in general would be a kind of not being overly proud, not being overly self-absorbed, and so on, being interested in others and so forth. Intellectual humility is like the intellectual aspect of that. It's not thinking that my ideas are better than everyone else, that I'm somehow I'm intellectually more important than everyone else, but being interested in what other people have to say, being open to the possibility of my fallibility, recognizing it. And so, when I talk to other people, I'm interested to hear what they have to say and to think about, to what extent should I change my mind? So being open-minded and so forth. So we can think of some of these traits as being specifically intellectual. And what interests me is that, what as an epistemologist, how do we promote those traits and what do they involve? And I think that what makes an intellectual virtue in part, at least, is this valuing of the truth, this veritic desire, as I call it. You know, someone can pretend to be intellectually humble. You know, you think about people on Twitter. You know, there's a lot of, I'm sure we can think of people, they're very good at pretending to be intellectually humble, but what drives them is not the truth. What drives them is they want people to like them or admire them or what have you. And that's not a virtue. For it to be a virtue, it's got to have the right kind of motivational state. And in the intellectual case, the intellectual virtues, that it's got to be rooted in a motivation, which is a care for the truth. So genuinely intellectually humble people, they don't care about this other stuff. You know, they don't care about, you know, being admired or whatever. What they care about is getting to the truth. And then, of course, we do admire them, but that's not what they're after. What they're after is the truth. And that grounds their certain kinds of behaviors, like their intellectual humility, their intellectual tenacity, their intellectual courage, and so on. So that's the intellectual virtues. I think they're really important traits. And indeed, I think actually all of us think that. I mean, you think of people you admire, particularly people you admire from an intellectual point of view. And I bet you when you start to describe them, you'll end up talking about intellectual virtues. This is the, you know, we recognize that this is a good way to be. I mean, Aristotle thought it's an ethic. So the good life, the life of flourishing, eudaimonia, is the virtuous life. And I think that's right. And so, and the thought is one aspect of the good life is an intellectual aspect. It's not just about morality, not just about, there's practical wisdom as well for Aristotle, but it's also about having good habits of thought. And if you think about that, makes sense. You know, when we think of, imagine someone is very moralistic, but then they lack intellectual virtues. People like that are usually a disaster. You know, there's this saying, I don't know if you have this in Portugal, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Do you have this saying?
Yes, we have a similar kind of phrase. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we can all think of people they have very earnest morality, but because they don't think things through and they're not careful about it's their morality, their moral urges are thrown all the wrong directions, whatever. You need to have good intellectual traits in order to ground your morality, in order to have it directed in the right kind of place. You know, like as Aristotle says, you know, like moral judgment is a kind of judgment, and therefore it requires a kind of knowledge, a kind of skill to make, you know, got to be alert to the relevant factors. And so the intellectual virtues are really crucial to morality. That's the way in which they interconnect. Of course, Aristotle thinks they connect even more closely, but certainly, you know, the good life has this important component, which is specifically intellectual.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to get here a little bit into education, because that's also a topic of your interest. But just before we do that, there's perhaps a little bit more ground in epistemology that we have to cover here that is probably also important to understand how you think about and approach education. So what role does luck play in epistemology?
So luck's really interesting because it seems like for knowledge, there seems to be an anti-luck condition. And what I mean by that is when you know something, it can't be that you get to the truth by luck, right? We seem to have this strong intuition about knowledge. Yeah. So, I mean, the obvious case like guesswork, you know, your lucky guesses aren't knowledge. But the more interesting cases are cases where you form your belief with good reasons. These are Gettier cases, they're so called. You have good reason to believe something, but even so, what you believe is only true as a matter of luck. So I'll give you a famous one. This is not Gettier's, it's Roderick Chisholm's. But you're a farmer, you're looking in a field, and you see what looks like a sheep. So you quite rightly believe there's a sheep in the field. And there is a sheep in the field, but what you're looking at isn't a sheep. What you're looking at is a big hairy dog, it looks like a sheep, which hidden from view behind that is a real sheep. Now we have a very strong intuition here. You don't know there's a sheep there, right? It's just luck that your belief happens to be true. Even though your belief is true and it's justified, it's just luck that it's true, so you don't know it. And that suggests that knowledge has this anti-luck bit. You can't get to knowledge through luck. So what we want when we think about what it is to know, we want to have ways of getting to the truth, which are sort of luck excluding. And one thing I tried to do in my work is it used to be that people just took this as just an obvious truth, and then they move on.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me, if we take it seriously, we should try and unpack it a little bit. And we've discovered when we unpack it, it gets quite interesting. So first off, if we unpack it, that means we need a theory of what luck is. And it really odd, until a few years ago, there wasn't a philosophical account of luck. The philosophers didn't talk about it. They just sort of took it as, we all know what luck, which is really odd if you think about it, because philosophers define everything, even things arguably they don't need to be defined. But they didn't bother with that. So one thing I tried to do was offer a theory of luck, and I have what's called a modal theory. And what that means is that roughly lucky, for an event to be lucky, it's got to be something that doesn't obtain but could have easily obtained. So, think about a lottery win. I've got this wrong around. For lucky, it obtains, but it could have easily not obtained. So it's the other way around. So think about a lottery win. What makes it a lucky win? Well, you won the lottery, but you could have easily not won the lottery, right? There's, think about, philosophers talk about possible worlds to make this vivid. So we're in the actual world. Well, we can imagine possible worlds. Worlds are slightly different from the actual world. And the more different they are, the further out they are. Mm-hmm. Well, you win the lottery, but there's lots of worlds just like this world you lost, right? And that's why it's lucky that you won the lottery. And conversely, if you don't win, that's why you're not winning as a matter of luck as well, because you could have easily won, right? Mm-hmm. So it works in both directions. I mean, even though the probabilities are massively against you, you could easily win the lottery, right? But all it needs is a few colored balls fall in a slightly different configuration. Yeah. Which is why, by the way, people play lotteries, but they don't make bets. They wouldn't make a bet with those kind of odds, but they play the lottery, because normally bets with long odds are on events that they don't happen in worlds like this world. The odds of, I think it's 16 million to 1, the British lottery. So let's say, if you wanted odds on me winning the Olympic gold at the next Olympics, that'd probably get 16 million to 1. But you'd be crazy to make that bet, because the world in which I win Olympic gold next Olympics is nothing like this world, right? It's not going to happen. I'd need to be 20 years younger, a different physique, and so on. But it's different in the case of the lottery. You place a bet on the lottery by buying a ticket, and you could easily win, right? I mean, that's why you do it. There used to be an advert in an advertisement in Britain for the lottery where they used to say the slogan was "It could be you," and they had this sort of finger of God floating, and people walking along with their tickets, and then they get zapped. Well, it's not, the could there is not a probabilistic could, right? Probabilistically, it couldn't be you, but it's a modal could. What it's saying is it could easily be you. Not much needs to change for you to, if you have a lottery, not much needs to change for you to be a lottery win. So I think that's what luck is. Luck is about modal closeness. It's about, even if you don't win the lottery, well, it's still, you could have easily won it, right? So that's why you're not winning as a matter of luck. Or if you do win, the fact that you've won is a matter of luck, because you could have easily not won, and so forth. Or in the sheep case, Schism's sheep case, it's lucky that his belief is true, because although he's got a true belief, it could have easily been false. If that sheep behind the sheep, big hairy dog, had wandered off, then his belief would have been false. So it's a matter of luck. Given how he formed his belief, it could have easily been false. So that's what luck is. And then once we understand what luck is, we can start to think about how that relates to knowledge and what it means in effect. I'll spare you the details, but if luck is a modal notion, then it means there needs to be this modal condition on knowledge. That's what I call a safety condition. Knowledge has to be safe, basically. It's not enough just to get to the truth, but you've got to get to the truth in a way which means that you couldn't have easily been wrong. So that's the anti-luck condition. And so we end up finding out something quite interesting about knowledge, about the conditions that it demands. And here's something else interesting as well, the results. You might think that knowledge has like an ability condition as well. It's like when you get to the truth through your abilities. You can't get there through, your guesswork, for example. You can't get there through, if you have, if someone thinks that they're clairvoyant, but they're not, and they predict something, and it turns out to be true, that they didn't let him know, right? Because that's not their actual abilities, It seems it's got to be your abilities to get there, these reliable traits to get you to the truth. And you might think, well, that's getting to the truth through reliable traits, that's luck excluding. And usually it is, but it's not always luck excluding, which is kind of interesting. I mean, think about the farmer. Mm-hmm. The farmer was getting to the truth in a way through their abilities. I mean, normally that's a good way of finding out whether there's a sheep in the field, is having a look, and if it looks like a sheep, believing it's a sheep. But your abilities can get you to the truth, and yet it could still be the case that your belief is lucky. So it seems like there are two slightly different conditions on knowledge. One is about getting there through your abilities. In other words, getting there in a way that excludes luck, and they're not quite the same thing. So I think you find out quite interesting things about the structure of knowledge by thinking about the role of luck again.
But since getting through your abilities and excluding luck as much as possible are not exactly the same thing, I mean, to what extent can we really be sure about how much epistemologically lucky we are?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So one of the things about skepticism is the radical skeptic, in a way, is trying to make it feel like it's just lucky that we get the truth, right? So remember that the radical skeptic, if they're clever, they won't say that you are a brain in the vat. They just say, well, you could be. For all you know, you could be. And of course, you can't tell. So it seems like, well, even if you are not a brain in the vat, even if everything is just exactly as you seem, it feels like, well, isn't it just a bit of luck that you happen to be in the world like this world rather than the world like that one? After all, you can't tell the difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of interesting. You can recast skeptical arguments in terms of this luck intuition, and I think that behoves us to come up with answers to the skeptical arguments. So that's true, and so hence another reason we have to deal with skepticism.
Mm-hmm. So another question then is, what is epistemic risk?
So it's really interesting. I started this debate about luck, and then I noticed that luck and risk go very closely together. I mean, they're not quite the same thing, but they're very close. They're almost like the same thing viewed from different angles. So think about, suppose you survive a plane crash. You might say, I'm lucky to be alive, right? And it seems one way of understanding that is, well, I could have easily died, right? Like if I'd been at the back of the plane, I would be dead, and I could have easily been at the back of the plane, but I was at the front of the plane. The front of the plane didn't get crushed in the crash, So I'm lucky to be alive. And that's from a sort of backwards perspective. I survived, I'm looking backwards, I say I'm lucky. You could rewind, as it were, from a forwards perspective. You could say the exact same thing and put it in terms of risk. Getting onto that plane, I'm at high risk of dying. And so what that seems to suggest is that risk is also a modal notion. What is for something to be high risk? It means it could easily, it's like a risk event, something you don't want to happen, could easily happen. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our assessments of risk, I think, are like that. Like if I'm wondering to myself, should I get on that plane? Is it risky? What I'm trying to think to myself is the possible world in which that plane crashes, is it a close world? Is it a world like this one? Is there something about that plane? Are the engines bad? Is the pilot a bad pilot? Are the weather conditions terrible, whatever? Is there something going on which would make it such that there are a close possible world where that plane crashes? If it is, then that's high risk. Whereas if it's not, if the plane is reliable and the weather conditions are great and the pilot's conscientious and so on, well, then there's low risk, because the risk event, the event of it crashing, is not close. It's not the kind of thing that could easily occur. So if that's right, then the modal account of luck and the modal account of risk, they go hand in hand. I mean, there are some complications I'll spare you. There's some slight differences, but roughly, we want to exclude luck. We want to exclude from knowledge. We also want to exclude risk. It's just a question of perspectives. Sorry, John.
Okay, but what if we were talking about epistemology and knowledge? What are we risking exactly?
Yeah, good. So I take it that the risk event when it comes to epistemology is falsehood. We're trying to get to the truth, and the risk event is, well, we fail. We end up with a false belief instead. So we have some way of forming a belief, and then in Gettier cases, and actually it gets us to the truth, but we think it's not knowledge because it could have easily led to the false. And you can run that whole thing in terms of risk. What you're saying is, in these Gettier cases, you've got a way of getting to the truth, which is risky because it could have easily led to falsity. So, it gets forwards versus backwards perspective again. the Gettier case, the person got to the truth, and we're looking backwards. It's a bit like surviving the plane crash. Well, I got to the truth, but I could have easily been wrong. We can rewind looking forwards. The farmer looks out into the field. Okay, they have a way of forming a belief that's generally a good way, but in these cases, it's risky because it could easily lead to a false belief, right? Because he could easily, the sheep wanders out of the field, then it'll end up with a false belief. So it seems like the drive to get rid of lucky true beliefs in knowledge also is a drive to get rid of risky true beliefs, get rid of high levels of epistemic risk. The reason why this is interesting, though, is that some people question the luck intuition. They say, well, is it so clear that we want to, why can't there be lucky knowledge? And it's interesting. Philosophers have that intuition quite strongly. I find even introductory students get that intuition very clearly. But there is some reason to think that the general public aren't so signed up to that intuition as we are. So, I mean, even in the case of a lucky guess, we often attribute knowledge. The contestant answers the question, they're obviously guessing. Someone in the other room says, did he know the answer? Gets it right? Yes, he knew the answer. That doesn't seem a terrible thing to say, right? Yeah. So a lot of people say, well, maybe luck is okay then. Well, but then suppose we run the same thing with risk. There does seem a stronger intuition that getting to knowledge shouldn't be compatible with high levels of epistemic risk. And so one thought you can have here is that risk is the more dominant notion. Like, why do you want to get rid of luck? It's because you want to get rid of risk. Because risk is a thing to be excluded. So the thought is risk is a more primary, even though they kind of go hand to hand, risk is the more primary notion because we care about getting rid of luck because really what we want to do is we want to minimize epistemic risk. And if that's right, that's a way of grounding that intuition about luck.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and when it comes to those intuitions that people have, I guess that it's very important here to keep in mind that, so for example, if someone just luckily guesses the right answer, it doesn't ring true that they really knew what the answer was, right? I mean, because knowing the answer is not, or guessing the correct answer is not the same as knowing it. I mean, that's also, I guess, at least if we explain that directly to people, it also seems intuitive, right? That if someone just guessed, it's not the same as them knowing it.
Right? Yeah. I mean, this is, I don't know if you've come across experimental philosophy, but this is one of the problems. Experimental philosophers, they test intuitions by going and asking the public questions, and then they get all the data, and then they come back and say, look, this is what the public think is intuitive. But intuitions aren't just your first judgment. Or the first judgment of the folk, as it were. That's not an intuition. And you know that you find this out very clearly when you start teaching philosophy. Your intuitions, as it were, are your sort of judgments under reflection. So, when you first start teaching students, and you can throw out a bunch of scenarios and their thoughts are all over the place. Is it this? Is it that? And then, as it were, over time, when they start to think about it, their thoughts start to stabilize. So in the quiz show case, they might say it's knowledge immediately. But then when they start to think about it, they say, well, it's not really knowledge, it's a guess, So as it were, that first judgment isn't stable. And what we're interested in when we talk about intuitions is those stable intuitions. It's not just the first judgment you come to. It's what when you think about it, you start to put it together and you start to reason it through. What judgment do you settle on? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of convergence. And the philosophers, what we're doing when we do philosophy is we're trying to examine our intuitions in that sense. We're trying to let them stabilize and we're trying to sift them through and see how they fit together. And it's that considered judgment is the intuition, not the sort of first judgment.
And since we're talking about risk here, what would an anti-risk epistemology be like?
Yeah, so what you want is, whereas before you'd have an anti-luck condition, instead you have an anti-risk condition. So you want to have a way of you'll build into your theory of knowledge some principle to the effect that you're forming your beliefs in ways that exclude high levels of risk, high levels of risk that your beliefs so formed will be false. And of course, given what I said earlier, that will be understood modally. So what it will mean is that given how you're forming beliefs, there are not close possible worlds where the risk event of a false belief occurs. So, like for say practical terms, I mean, this is why guesswork is no good, because guesswork might get you the truth in the actual world, but of course it could easily get you to it's lots of risks. There's lots of close worlds where it gets to a false belief. But the more reliable your belief forming methods are, then the more likely it is it will exclude high levels of risk. The more likely it is that it will exclude risk in close worlds. So you can explain a lot of why we care about certain kinds of methods, belief forming methods, because they're risk excluding.
Mm-hmm. So just before we get into education, then, are there valuable kinds of ignorance? I mean, are there perhaps instances where ignorance would actually be valuable?
Yeah, I mean, ignorance is, so for now, just take ignorance, as I'll explain in a minute, this is not quite right, but take ignorance to be lack of knowledge. A lot of people think that it is.
Yeah.
Well, then it can be useful. It can be very valuable to not know things, in the sense that it can open your mind, as it were. There's a saying about like sometimes when people they know a few things. I mean, there's the saying I was thinking of: a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. I don't know if you have a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? It's like, well, you know a few things. Because you know a few things, you think you kind of know everything. And so it kind of gives you a kind of dogmatic way of thinking about the world, but you really only know a few things. And so it's quite useful sometimes to have that little bit of knowledge shaken, like have your world to be open up, and defeaters come. Defeaters like, new ways of thinking and so on. And those new ways of thinking can shake up. And so you start to doubt even what you knew, even though you did know it. And so in that sense, ignorance can be a good thing. It can spur on. I mean, it's very interesting in the early modern period with the scientific revolution and so on, that was driven by the rediscovery of skeptical texts, Pyrrhonian texts, in fact. People started doubting more. In doubting more, it drove inquiry. There were some things they knew, but they started to question everything, because a lot of what they knew was grounded in tradition and religious authority and so on, and they doubt it, and then they start to reground it in new ways, which are better ways, and so forth. So that's one sense in which ignorance can be a good thing. There's another sense in which ignorance is a good thing, which relates to, which comes clear once we compare lack of knowledge with ignorance. I think ignorance is more specific than lack of knowledge. So ignorance is, as I would say, is normative. And what I mean by that is ignorance is not just lack of knowledge, but it's lack of knowledge that you ought to have. So there's lots of things I don't know right now. I don't know how many spoons are in my kitchen cupboard, but I wouldn't say I was ignorant of them. I mean, why should I? There's no reason to know such a thing. In fact, it would actually be a negative thing about me, I think, if I knew that. It would be concerning. I'm not a virtuous person from an intellectual point of view if I know such things, because that means I've actually gone to the trouble of finding it out. There's no point in finding it out. So mere lack of knowledge doesn't make you ignorant. I think it's got to be lack of knowledge of things you ought to know. But what you ought to know, as it were, is not a fixed matter. If a child doesn't know, arcane facts about physics, we don't think they're ignorant. We just think they don't know, right? There's no expectation. They don't ought to know. There's no ought for the child, right? They ought to know about the things, their playthings and so on. They don't need to know about this stuff. But, if you're a physicist, now there are all sorts of things about physics that you really ought to know. And if you don't know, that's ignorance. That means that you've failed in some way as an inquirer. And I think this is one of the senses in which education opens up vistas. And in doing so, it makes it such that there are now things you ought to know. Like, we hold educated people to a higher standard of ignorance, I think, than uneducated people, because we think now there's a wider class of things they really ought to know. And if they don't know, that shows a bad character, that they don't know these things. So this is the sense in which ignorance can be, I mean, I don't like, so, going back to my point earlier, so lack of knowledge contrasted with ignorance now. There may be things that I don't know which are valuable because I don't ought to, there's no reason to know them. So it's actually a good thing I don't know. It's a good thing I don't know how many spoons are in my cupboard. That reflects well upon me as an inquirer. so that's a, if we think lack of knowledge is ignorance, well, that would be good. But I mean, as I'm saying, actually, what that reveals is that there's more to ignorance than just lack of knowledge.
But since at the very beginning of your answer, you mentioned, for example, the scientific revolution and how back then, a few centuries ago, one of the things that actually drove it, at least in the initial stages, was some people rediscovering, so to speak, some skeptic texts. I mean, one thing that came to mind was, so I mean, I guess that there's a distinction to be made between two different kinds of ignorance, because, I mean, people can be aware of the fact that they lack certain kinds of knowledge. Like, for example, I've talked with many anthropologists on the show, and I'm very well aware that there are parts of human evolution, for example, that I'm not knowledgeable of, but I know that I lack that knowledge. But there's a difference between that and people not even being aware that there's things that they don't know about and that they don't even know they should know about, or that they even exist out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, as I say, one of the wonders of education. It can open your eyes to, I mean, one of the dangers, not knowing what you don't know, right? This is, I mean, we're all in this condition to a certain extent, but you can, education improves you a lot here. It makes you more aware of what you don't know. So you know more about what you don't know, but through being educated. And so even though now you might be still that you're ignorant, you ought to know. But the fact that you're aware that you're ignorant of it is an improvement upon someone who isn't aware of their ignorance. So that's actually it's like a lesser grade of ignorance. It's a better situation to be in. And education is really important for that, to make people aware of that. It's one of my favorite sayings, actually. They don't know what they don't know. I mean, I think a lot of debates, people would be better off. I mean, just think about it. I mentioned intellectual humility earlier on. It's hard to be intellectually humble if you don't realize how little you know. I mean, I don't know if you've been following these was this conflict in the Middle East right now, and people on Twitter wading in with very strong opinions. And in some cases, they clearly know nothing. They know nothing about the history, absolutely nothing. But it doesn't stop them having strong opinions. They don't know what they don't know, right? And that level of ignorance is actually quite, in this case, I think it's quite dangerous. Most debates are improved by people being more aware of their ignorance. Of course, even better improved if they're not ignorant at all, but at least be aware of your ignorance.
So there are many things in epistemology that we've talked about here, like the virtues, like luck, risk, ignorance. What should education actually be about when considering all of these aspects of epistemology that we've talked about? I mean, what should education include exactly?
So education has lots of aims. Not all of them are epistemic. So some of them are social, some of them are political, and some of them are practical and so on. But it seems to me a core aim is epistemic. And what I mean by it being a core aim is that it's part of what makes it an educational practice at all, is that it's directed at epistemic goods. So, like imagine in North Korea, let's say they have an education program which is just indoctrination. They might call it education, but it isn't education, right? Whatever that is, right? You might have the name, but it isn't education because it doesn't serve epistemic goods. So what makes an educational practice at all is epistemic goods. So in that sense, the epistemic goods are constitutive of the practice. They're fundamental. And that raises the question, well, which epistemic ends are they? A lot of people, I think the ends are just, it's what I call the bucket view. So, the student is like an empty bucket, and the student and the job of the teacher is just to fill the bucket with facts and skills and things. And that's actually an absolutely terrible way of thinking about education. It's surprisingly durable, in certain quarters of the world, but it's terrible. I mean, if you think a lot of old, Victorian teaching was rote. I don't know if this is the same everywhere, but in Britain, rote learning. I know in North America is like this as well. So rote learning, where you just get people to memorize things. And it was done in a sort of disciplinarian fashion, like you were beaten if you didn't memorize things and so on. That's very much wedded to the bucket model. The bucket, you are a bucket, and we just train you like we just fill you up, and that's all there is. There's a different way of thinking about education now, which I think is far more plausible, and it's education is sort of it goes with this idea of education as liberatory, as liberating the individual. It's very much enlightenment ideas about education have sort of wedded to this, helping the person to realize their potential, to fulfill their intellectual potential. And that view, I think, goes hand in hand with a different idea, which is education is about cultivating intellectual character. And I would say virtuous intellectual character. Because we want students to think for themselves. We want the students to acquire the good habits of thought so that they can, make reasonable judgments, and they can basically just think for themselves. That's what they want to do. So it's obviously we want to teach them facts and skills, but the thought is the teaching of the facts and skills should be grounded in a more general attitude of helping them to flourish intellectually. And that means developing their intellectual virtues. And this is something I'm a big fan of. I mean, I think that's when you look at good teachers, I think, just do this instinctively. But what this provides, I think, is a kind of theory, a sort of conceptual scheme for making sense of what good teaching looks like. I mean, think about how good teachers don't just give you the answer, and they don't drum the answer into you either. They want to create the conditions under which you can find the answer for yourself. It's what educationalists call productive struggle. They want you to strive to get to the truth yourself. And they're trying to instill in you a desire to get there and a joy in getting there, because they're hoping you can internalize these traits so that you become the kind of person that's curious and drives your inquiry and so on. And indeed, good teachers, I think, tend to be intellectually virtuous. They, when you think about a really good teacher, they're people who really care about the truth. They care about, accuracy and so on. And they instill those kinds of traits into those around them. They are, as Aristotle would say, they're exemplars. We learn the virtues primarily through emulating exemplars. And good teachers, I think, that's their virtuous exemplars, intellectually virtuous exemplars. And so, yeah, I've been very interested in this whole theory behind this. And in fact, I'm trying to put it into practice. I run a project here. It's called the Anteater Virtues. So the mascot of UC Irvine is the anteater. Peter the Anteater is their mascot. So we call them the Anteater Virtues. So we focus on a core set of intellectual virtues, which I think are important. And we try and embed the teaching of those virtues into our education across all levels. So from orientation through to graduation, we try and give students and faculty this sort of conceptual scheme to think about what they're doing in terms of cultivating intellectual character. And I think this is really important because a lot of students, I think increasingly so, they think about education instrumentally. It's just a means to an end. It's just about grades and so on. And this isn't good. It's not good for the soul. It's not good for your well-being. You've got to think, it's far better to be able to think about education as something which is developing you as a person, your personal growth. And I think that's where the virtues come in. We're trying to get students to have this scheme to think more broadly about what education is and how it's going to benefit them. If they do it well, it will benefit them, whatever skills get lost, facts get forgotten, but the virtues stay with you, right? Those kinds of traits, once they're had, they're not easily lost because you see their value. And they will, whatever you do in life, they will help you prosper. They'll help you live, and not just prosper financially or whatever, career-wise, but prosper as a person, in terms of your relationships, in terms of your hobbies, in terms of your choices, in terms of, what you do in your retirement or what have you. These are good traits to have. So these are the things I think a good education should be trying to foster.
So are you actually testing that out empirically? I mean, how we can cultivate these intellectual virtues in that case, university students?
Yeah. So this is really quite exciting because people have done this sort of thing in schools a lot and with lots of good results, but no one's ever done it at a university. And there's a reason for that. It's very difficult to change curriculums at a university, right? Academics very much, they just do their own thing, they're very autonomous. But we're very lucky at UC Irvine. There's a real culture of pedagogical innovation. We have a chancellor and a vice provost that are really interested in these ideas. And so there's a lot of institutional backing for us to do this project. So we're now embedding these modules in, and because we're academics, there's a, as you say, there's a research project about measuring its effects. So we have a group of educational theorists and sociologists, and they're running a longitudinal empirical study testing for the empirical effects of what we're doing. So we have, like, people, we have a control group of students who aren't doing the modules and ones that are, and we've seen the difference. And the results we're getting are very good, and they confirm what you get in schools as well, which is when you explicitly educate for intellectual virtues, you get an increase in educational outcomes. You get an increase in well-being, which is very important. But you get an increase in educational outcomes. Students who do this, they do well. Whatever they do well. And the other thing that's really interesting about this is that when you have an intervention in education of pretty much any kind, you get positive effects just because it's an intervention, right? You're doing something extra. So if you take a bunch of school children and you start teaching them French, another group you don't teach them French. Well, the students who learn French, there'll be all kind of positive effects from them learning something new. But when you teach the intellectual virtues, you don't just get positive effects of the normal kind. You get like enhanced positive effects. It sort of ripples out. It's a bigger positive effect, and it's also one that doesn't care about where you come from. It doesn't care about who you are. So a lot of times when you have an intervention, educational intervention, the students who are doing well benefit the most, and the students who are doing not so well benefit the least, right, as you'd expect. But when it comes to virtues, everyone benefits roughly the same, which is kind of interesting. It's a kind of it's like a golden bullet, as it were. It has this magical effect of improving everybody's outcomes. And relatedly, it doesn't matter doesn't matter you're male or female, doesn't matter what your economic background is, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, and so on. You get the same kind of positive effects. So what we're trying to do with this project is obviously we want to improve education at Irvine, but we have all these materials and we have this study, and the idea is to make them publicly available, and the study is publicly available. And so we want to change the conversation about education, higher education in particular. What is the point of higher education? I mean, I think there is a real question, particularly post-COVID. What's the point? A lot of people are asking this. COVID, everything went online. Why can't universities go online, right? Why don't we do that? Why don't we just have online classes and you get your grades? Why do you go to university? There's the real questions about the value of it, and I think we need to reassert what's so important about it. And I think core to that of our mission really is instilling these intellectual virtues and showing how they help people to thrive and to prosper.
Mm-hmm. So let's put a pin on going to university online, because I want to ask you a little bit more about what you think might be the role of technology here. But one more question I wanted to ask you about that project that you're running is, do you have, at least with the data that you already have, is it possible to tell if these intellectual virtues that you are cultivating in students would stick with them long term? I mean, even after they finish university and for, I guess, ideally the rest of their lives, because I mean, as with other things in education, I mean, sometimes it's a matter of people just forgetting things they learned. Other times it's not exactly that issue, but more of an issue of the social environment people find themselves in when they're going to work and in other contexts of their lives that really does not promote something that they have learned. And in this particular case, I mean, I would be worrying if that would also have an effect in terms of the intellectual virtues they were inculcated with, let's say.
That's a really good question. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been an empirical study on it. We can't test it just yet. We're doing a longitudinal study, so we're testing it throughout the course of the degree. Of course, when students leave, difficult to keep track of them. We do want to do that. That would be like if we're thinking of a follow-on grant, we track them afterwards and see what happens. But that's quite a tricky thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I did a project years ago with prisoners. We a prison education project. We track students, prisoners who were learning about the intellectual virtues, got the great effects. But then when they leave, just privacy considerations, we're not allowed. We just weren't allowed, right? We're not allowed to track them any further. Which was a real shame, because it would be lovely to find out, well, does it affect recidivism rates?
Mm-hmm.
Do they? It seems plausible. We had these big effects on the prisoners. Seems plausible that they're less likely to reoffend. No idea, though, because we can't test it. So we would like to do that, and there should be results. I mean, intuitively, it feels like character traits look like they have more stability than mere skills. I mean, one of the big challenges for education is this problem of degradation. A lot of what we teach students gets lost, and it gets lost very quickly. We spend years, a lot of money training people up in knowing things and having skills, and then you test them 5 years later, and most of it's gone. But you see, here's where it gets interesting, because if going back to the value of an education, one conclusion, well, what's the point then? Maybe it's better if they just did something else. But actually, if, as I think is plausible, what we're doing in education is developing character, and the character isn't the sort of thing that just degrades so quickly, which seems plausible, well, then that would be with the point of education. So I would bet my bottom dollar that intellectual character doesn't degrade quickly in the way that mere skills and memory does. But that's, as you said, that's an empirical question. Someone needs to test that. Maybe we'll get to do it. It's a hard thing to test, but it does need testing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I was mostly worrying about here, and if that's true, of course, it would be no one's fault, I guess. But one thing is for individuals to have their own character traits that they can develop, of course. But I mean, there's also the context. Right. And I mean, people are part of a particular social, epistemic context. And I mean, I would worry that if, for example, they move into work and other contexts of their life that do not really promote the flourishing of these intellectual virtues and other related traits, that if they would really last, because I mean, I don't know if you agree with me or not, but I guess it's when it comes to humans, it's not just about the character traits that we as individuals have. I mean, the environment that surrounds us also plays a big role, actually, in allowing for the flourishing of those same traits, right?
No, I absolutely agree. So, I mean, I have an interest in this. So there are certain kinds of workplaces that in theory are meant to promote intellectual virtues, like science. You might think science ought to be one. And so one issue there is, well, does it? And if not, so if not, how do you fix that? And I've written few things about this. So in the scientific case, people worry about, well, there's drive for results, there's drive for grants. To what extent does that undermine these intellectual virtues? And one thing we've argued, I have a paper on this with a colleague, where it would be good to institute certain kinds of frameworks into, and there's some of them is there already. I mean, I think some of the things about academic honesty and misconduct and so on, that kind of in part speak to that. But you can develop frameworks which reward intellectually virtuous inquiry and so on. And there'd be ways of doing that, because you can see how this would benefit the discipline as a whole, benefit science as a whole. If people aren't just thinking about, the prizes and the grants, but they're also thinking about getting to the truth and so forth. And you can imagine a similar thing might work with other disciplines where you'd want the intellectual virtues to be prominent, like, journalism, let's say, or, government, The tricky one is where you've got like private industry. And, I mean, even in private industry, there'll be aspects of it, like there'll be a regulatory part of it. When if you're in the sort of energy industry, then you want people who are regulating it to be directed by intellectual virtues, to care about the truth. If someone's regulating, nuclear facilities, you don't want them worrying about. I mean, this is I don't know if you ever saw that great program Chernobyl. It was a TV series about Chernobyl disaster.
Yeah, I watched some of it. Yeah.
What was really interesting about that, which came across quite vividly, is that the concern for the truth, it fell away. They started to believe the lies, as it were, the sort of state-funded lies. And the idea is like you can get away with that in the short term, but in the long term, you just can't get away with it. And that's the Chernobyl disaster is like, reality, as it were, as they say, biting you on the bottom sort of thing, come back to haunt you. You can't get away with sort of fabricating the truth indefinitely. So there's something to even like in private industry, you could it's harder, I think, to make the case there. But even there, I think you can make the case that if your structures in your company aren't grounded in desire for the truth, then maybe in the short term you'll get benefits. People are sort of cutting corners or whatever and getting results, but in the long term, it's going to come back to haunt you. You'll have people who are doing inappropriate things, and so forth. You need a culture of care for the truth. It's actually, I think, is a way for us all to prosper, including, I think, even in the private industry case. Well, that's the harder case. But you're absolutely right that context. Take someone with good character, force them to be in a social context where no one cares about good character, that you're making it hard for them to manifest their good character. And you can. I think this gets depicted quite vividly in novels. There's a certain kind of novel, someone looking back on their life and they start off well and it all goes wrong. It's because they embedded themselves in the wrong kind of environment and they absorbed the values of that environment. And in doing so, it's like a tragic flaw, as it were. In doing so, they cut themselves off from certain other kinds of goods, like the person who becomes career orientated in a way they never were. And then on their deathbed, they realize they neglected the people they cared about,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking also that perhaps sometimes in epistemology, philosophers also talk about the concept of epistemic responsibility, and I would guess that it's not circumscribed to individuals. I mean, of course, individuals have their own epistemic responsibility, but it's also a sort of shared responsibility. I mean, there's a sort of broader social epistemic responsibility that we should have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just about the individual themselves, but also about the broader social epistemic environment, right?
Yeah, and I think this is increasingly important in the information age with the way, like, it's very hard, increasingly hard to insulate yourself from the social world around you. And I mean, think about the misinformation that occurs on the internet and how harmful that is. I mean, I've been reading some of these studies about like educational performance in teenagers, and it's dropping off the cliff, and they think it's phone use and social media use. There's things you can do as an individual to combat misinformation, but if the structures around you are massively wedded to developing this misinformation and leading you astray and so on, there's limits to what you can do as an individual. And I think then we need ways of controlling that. How do we? And it's a really hard question to solve because we also believe in free expression. We don't want the state interfering overly in private lives and so on. So there's a real trade-off here. But I think, I by the way, like Twitter or X or what it's called now, they'd have these reader commentaries. I think that's a really interesting development. It's a kind of it's not perfect, but it's a good sort of democratic way of getting people to realize that the information they're being fed is at least suspect, when you have these reader commentaries and so on. And then people can rate them, so then you get a kind of feedback loops and so on. And I think, that there are ways to mitigate this, but we do, and these are basically they're structural ways of mitigating it. We can't put all the emphasis on the individual because I think that's just too much of a demand. We have to think of ways to make it easier for the individual to promote their character in these epistemically unfriendly environments.
So since you mentioned social media there and misinformation, I guess that would make for a good segue into my last question then. So how do you look at the role of technology in education? I mean, do you look at it mostly positively, mostly negatively, and I mean, positively or negatively, what do you think is the role that it can and should play in education?
Well, I mean, one way I think about technology, you can think of it as like a tool, and tools, well, they're used well or they weren't used badly, and generally speaking, they're a good thing. But of course, they can, but with the proviso they can be used badly. So like with calculators come along, and then it used to be that people could do certain kinds of arithmetical calculations in their head. People don't do it anymore because what's the point? We've got this there. So in one sense, you have a kind of degradation of onboard cognitive powers, but in a sense, it's kind of harmless because the tool we're embedded in an environment where the tool is available. So, in a sense, and I would view that generally positive. I think it goes to the extended cognition, that this way of thinking about the idea behind extended cognition is that we're kind of apt, as the kind of subjects we are, to offload to our environment cognitive processes because that's the most efficient way to do things. You can even think of language as being a bit like this. If you try and do everything in your head, but then you verbalize it and then you can write it down. Writing something down is a good way of thinking. Which is kind of interesting. Like I find typing is a way to clarify my thoughts. It's like you externalize your thoughts and through the technology, and then that helps you to think more clearly about what I think. If I try and do that in my head, it's harder. And lots of things are like this. We offload, and and as it were, the technology becomes part of the cognitive process, and that's extended cognition. The thought is, it's not just tool use; it's more than just tool use. As it were, the tools, as it were, become part of the technology, becomes part of the overall cognitive process.
Yes,
and this has been going on for a long time. But what's interesting about the information age is that, two things. I mean, one is massive increase in the way in which we're embedded in technological environments. It's not just like pen and paper. It's there, but it's everywhere. You think you walk into a shop, you use the app and so on, and you're looking up things, and so there's information on the boards and so on, which is responsive to you and so forth. So it's massive increase in that. But the other thing is that, as it were, the technology which has become incorporated into your processes is information processing technology. So, like the pen that's not information it's just simply a mean. It's a bit like, a walking stick is a means to walking, and a pen is like a means to writing. But the phone, your phone, as it were, which is now like it's wedded to you, right? Most people, they lose their phone, they feel like this is an injury to themselves. And there's a reason for that, I think, because in a sense, it is a bit like themselves. It's like an extension of them. A lot of their thinking is done through their phone. A lot of their cognition, we used to memorize phone numbers in our head. We talked about the phone book earlier. So you must be old enough to. Are you old enough then? I remember when I used to know like about a dozen phone numbers. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I don't even know. I think I know my own phone number. I maybe know one other, but I don't know any others. But now they're all in the phone, as it were. There's all that information that would have been in your head is now in the phone. And so it's kind of like an extension. It's like there's your onboard memory and then your technological memory. And so something very different is occurring now. We've got information processing occurring, which is kind of like your information processing, but it's outside your head. Like if someone says, do you know that phone number? Do you know so-and-so's phone number? You say yes. And then you go to your phone. And that's kind of interesting. It's like, do you know it? Well, I know it because me, as it were, is not just me in my head. It's me and this thing attached to my body as well, So I think this is this gets really interesting. And of course, now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I mean, generally speaking, it's a good thing if the technology is reliable. And generally speaking, it's a bad thing if the technology is giving us bad answers. So, if it seems true that a lot of this social media is, it's leading us into silos of thought, leading us into misinformation, and so on, well, that's problematic. It can also be problematic in another way, which is that if to use technology well means to be intellectually virtuous in your use of it. And this is something I've argued you can't offload to technology. The intellectual character, as it were, is about you and not about the technology. and what we want to instill in people is good character, so that the way in which they incorporate the technology is virtuous. And if you don't instill that good character, then I think what happens is that the technology gets incorporated and it just amplifies the bad character. And I think we see this, like people who have got intellectual vices, who are prone to dogmatism, for example. You get a dogmatic person, and then now they're wedded to their phone and to the internet, and the internet, as it were, confirms their dogmatism, makes them more dogmatic. It makes them, as Locke would say, an enthusiast. This is the worst kind of dogmatist. They have full of passionate intensity, to use Yeats's famous phrase, passionate intensity, but for all the wrong things, So, they lack the humility, as we were saying earlier. They don't know what they don't know, and so forth. So it's really important now, increasingly important, we give people the intellectual virtues, so that when they do make use of this technology, we amplify the good traits in them and don't amplify the bad traits. And of course, it's also important that we have, as I mentioned before, these structural constraints which help people to be virtuous. Because as you say, you put a virtuous person in an epistemically unfriendly environment, over time, it's going to be very hard for them to maintain their virtue. So we have to make it so that it's not so unfriendly, the environment, that it does that.
Great. So let's end on that note then. And Dr. Pritchard, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah. So I'm very lucky in the internet age in that my name is quite unusual. So it's funny, like, when we were growing up, it wouldn't matter what your name was. You could be Joe Blogs or whatever, and so what, right? But now it turns out having a name that a lot of people don't have is a really useful thing, because then people can put your name into the internet. If you put Duncan Pritchard Philosophy, I come up. Whereas if my name was, John Smith, it'd be like a million things. How would you tell me apart? So I'm very lucky on that score. You put Duncan Pritchard Philosophy, come up. But I have a web page, which is, again, I think it's www.duncanpritchard.org, which has my papers on there and has stuff. It has about my Anti-to Virtues project, if you're interested in that. It talks about the other things I've done, like the prison work and so forth, and my interest in education and so forth. So everything's there. If you're interested, by all means, drop me a line.
Great. So I'm leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Pritchard, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Ricardo. Thanks very much for having me on. That was great.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per-Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fort, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht, A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets and Rosie. Thank you for all.